Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for the final session now in this, what I hope has been a fascinating conference for you all. Our final speaker, and dare I say the most important of the day, because he is my boss, is Rod Jarman, Chair of the London Policing College, Senior Officer in the Metropolitan Police, 32 years service, ended as a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, and had responsibility and oversight for all leadership and training, which he's taken with him in retirement into the outside world, and now runs the London Policing College with the international network that we see today, amongst many other things. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you Rod Jarman for the final session of the day. Over to you, Rod. Thank you.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for the speeches and presentations so far, and I just do my thanks to Bob and Karen and Daisy for the work that's gone into getting us to where we are today. The intention I have now is to try and pull this together and show where we're taking the outcomes from this moving forward. So I'm going to run through a presentation, and then at the end of it we should have some time for questions. Now I'm hoping, I can't see from here whether you can see my presentation. Is that correct, Karen, or someone let me know?
Yes, we can see your presentation, Rod.
Excellent, because I can't, which is really weird. Okay, so what I was going to go through is looking at what we've learned, a little bit about how we could apply the stuff from the COVID-19 control to crime generally, some transferable matters, how we can transfer not just our learning but the activity of people to other situations, how we can keep the energy which has clearly been applied by so many people to get us to where we are at the moment, and then to look at the next steps in terms of research, exchange and learning, and what we might do later on. I just wanted to just quickly summarize what I think has come out so far from the presentations today. Big chunk around information exchange, looking at risk management, how we're collecting data and what it means and how we're sharing it. Resilience, how we're using that to keep people resilient and safe, and what's happening with research moving forward. Focus on some of the issues. So of police and community, what's the relationship between the police and the community, how all parts of government as well as the police and community have had to be focused on this, so it's not just a health issue, it is a whole society issue. And I sort of thought that although the flu pandemic was the #1 risk in the UK before this, we hadn't actually planned for something that was going to have this amount of interaction across government, across society, and change the role of policing as much as it has. Key thing come through, I think, from across the world is officer dedication. Whether you look at what's happened in Peru with the very large numbers of deaths and the police still going out there, to the sorts of comments I think every police force has struggled with getting PPE to start with, and the fact that officers on a daily basis are going out to deal with situations that are putting them and their families at risk is a massive point that we shouldn't forget in any of these conversations. And the other thing I think we've seen from policing across the world is this innovation, looking not just at technology, but things like cultural awareness, thinking how we might work differently with people. The 4 E's or the 3 E's, you know, the whole thought about let's come up with a process for actually describing what the police is. The changes in crime and how they are going about and what they're making us think about in terms of our response, you know, more digital crime, move towards domestic crime, all those sorts of things. And the final thing which really touched home, I think, with many of us with Roger's workshop right at the beginning of this process, was this thought about this as a crisis rather than a major incident, and that wicked problems like this need more complex and longer term solutions than we are used to thinking about. So the return to normality, what does that mean and where is it coming from? And I think one of the things that I hadn't sort of put on here when I was going through today, but reflecting back on the comments from Matt Twist and also from May Britt just recently about this incursion into private space surveillance or private space policing. The policing role has changed quite significantly this year. We've moved away from being the police that deal with things that happen in public places into the police that are concerned about what's happening on your phone, or what's happening in your home, what's happening in a whole number of arrangements where historically we haven't been. And I think Maybrit summed this up quite nicely just a few seconds ago, but will we return to the old model of policing, or is this the way that we're going to be moving forward? Oh, it's not quite what I meant to happen. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly run through the context, because although we've talked about this quite a lot, I think we sometimes underplay just how significant the things are we're dealing with, but I'm going to go through this very quickly. These are the UK figures at the moment, so 61,000 deaths. Even though you could say many of those were with people at the very end of their life, an awful lot of them weren't. So this is probably one of the most impacted things that's happened in 3 generations for people in the UK, and that's the same across the world. And as you can see, we still haven't really got through this second wave yet to what's happening. This sort of graph, I think, is also impacted. When we're talking about recovery of bodies, at one stage we had just short of 9,000 people die in a week. Now that's just an unbelievable number of people to be going through a hospital and dying, going through hospitals and dying, and having to just deal with the logistics of that safely and find our way through it is one of those things which I don't think people have really picked out in society. And in the UK, we've sort of focused on this 2 aspects. One is the death and the other is the economy. And this is a map of the economy going back to 2008. And GDP gently growing since the massive crisis in 2008. We saw that little, basically a blip compared with what we've seen now. And then this crash in 2020. And the likelihood is that there will be another big drop now as we've gone into our second series of issues. Now that has big problems, and we've heard about the, I think Martin Hewitt started it, but there's been a theme through here about what's going to happen to police funding in the future. But it isn't just police funding, it's funding for a whole range of things, going from the charity aspect, the NGOs who are supplying frontline services to people to support them, and to help get into places where policing hasn't been in the past. They're going to come under squeeze as much as policing is, as much of all those people involved in resilience. And that is going to cause us some real problems in the future in terms of how we think about what our role is moving forward. This was the quite an interesting one for me, but unfortunately I couldn't get more recent data than August, but this shows how quickly people think this will be over. So in the UK, to start with, over 50% of people thought it would take less than 6%, and 10% said it would take more than a year. Those have turned over now, so it's 30% more than a year and 20% less than 6 months, but 6 months from the 26th of July. So really interesting to see how people have had to cope with perceptions of what normality is and perceptions of when things might come back to something that they were used to in the past. So this thought process is quite intense in people and quite upsetting, I think is probably the best word for it, in terms of how people plan their lives. The other thing which I thought was really worth just picking up on was changes in behaviour and the unintended consequences they have. So this series of graphs is quite hard to get your head around to start with, but the 100% line along the left is what people were doing before the start of lockdown in the UK. The blue line is car journeys, so we were at 100% at the beginning, and as you can see, massive drop during the first lockdown. That steadily increased, but still not reached the same levels as it was at before. The yellow line is cycling, which is gone massively up, but as it's a percentage, it's gone massively up from a very low percentage level. So quite complex sort of to draw out how much that is. But cycling in the UK has definitely changed its level of importance to people. And the two which hadn't really, until we started looking at this data, thought about was the bus journeys and train journeys. So even now, the brown line of the train journeys, we're still not up to 35% of what train journeys were before this started, and bus journeys are just about 50% of what they were before. So the society has stopped travelling in the way that it used to. It's stopped moving in the way it's used to, and that affects a whole number of things. And we've heard about how the police have had to be very agile to move resources from one area to another, but also in the UK, the number of serious road collisions has gone up during this period. So just moving people from traffic into another area or removing people from the buses, we now have to support bus drivers, making people wear masks, trains, making sure people are properly behaving on trains as well. So there's a really complex picture here in terms of what policing is about. This was about people working from home. So we've seen, this was one snapshot of a week in October. The tiers in the UK, tier 1 is the lowest tier, tier 3 is the highest tier in terms of risk. So people between 25 and 35% of people are now working exclusively from home. Now that is a massive shift in behaviours to have happened, and very unsettling for people whose whole pattern of life is based around their journey to work, what they do at work, massively disrupting to people's concept of what their role is in society. And this graph sort of indicates the difference for different people. And rather than increasing it too much, I think it's just worth noting that the people who are worst impacted upon by all of this are the people who earn the least amount of money. So those people who are in poorly paid jobs, hourly paid jobs, those people who are earning under £20,000 a year, so below the average, are the ones who have lost work, who have reduced the amount of work. And looking forward, they are the ones who are most likely to be impacted going further, because their roles are the ones that have stopped existing. Rather than try and explain all the data on here, it's probably just worth mentioning that what this graph shows is that predominantly the impact is not the same to men and women, and it's not the same for people of different ethnic origins. So we've seen many more Black people die. Once you adjust it for age, once you adjust it for geography, social economics, and health and diversity, Black people are still 2.5 times more likely to die of this disease, Black men than women, and 2 times more likely Black females than white females. And that sort of runs down all of these groups. As you can see, there's a big difference there. And over time, these sorts of differences become very important in society. So I have in my family a lot of people from Black and Indian backgrounds. They all have very close members of their family who they know who died from this. Many of my white friends don't. So there's a big difference in terms of how people are actually feeling this disease. It's not just a question of what's happening, it's the perception of who you know who's been severely affected by it. And I think the other thing, sorry, so that was really just trying to grab some data. And then what I wanted to move on to was a little bit about the models of control that we've applied in the UK to try and, or applying some models to look at what we've done in the UK to try and control this from a policing perspective. So I started off looking at really, I think Martin Hewitt, that is, very diplomatically described some of the tensions between police and government, and looked at, when you look at the political model for compliance, what has the government messaging been about compliance and how they're enforcing it. And I think the big thing that we've heard the government talk about is we've given extra money for this, for law enforcement, for other things. We've increased the number of officers at the beginning of this whole event. We were just starting to recruit an additional 20,000 police officers across England and Wales, and that number has continued to try and be met through this. But we've also seen government bring in huge numbers of new powers for police on a scale that I cannot imagine ever having happened before. We've also got a model of compliance which is looking at who's responsible for the resolution. So everything has been about a vaccine being the end. And I think a couple of people have talked about this, about the vaccine may bring some safety for people in the short term, but in the longer term, the whole world has been affected by this, and it'll take us a long time to get rid of this particular version of COVID-19 and what comes next, and how are we getting ready for what might possibly come next. And I think the other thing that from a political point of view we've seen is this communication message. We've had daily briefings from the Prime Minister or senior members of the government in the first 4 or 5 months. A huge amount of discussion around fear and risk, what is going to happen, and the big thing is about the NHS being overwhelmed and there not being any hospital beds. That's the big message which keeps on coming through. The other one is around offences and prosecutions, that people will be prosecuted who do not comply. These are easy messages to get across, but what is hard is to understand what it is people are trying to behave differently at. We've seen people not travelling. We know people are not working in the way they used to. But what are we trying to change on a daily basis amongst society which will make a difference in the long term? This figure I thought was really interesting because this was about social distancing. So all the evidence I've seen suggests that social distancing, the washing your hands, keeping a distance and wearing a face mask, most important things you could do. And if you look at this, 70% of people are always complying with social distancing. When you look into the data in more detail, the one about washing hands is they wash their hands when they come home. So it's not like we've changed behaviour to match some of the behaviour in other countries, behaviour where people are constantly thinking about hygiene and how they manage their lives, where the wearing of face coverings has been normal in many countries for a long time. The constant taking of temperatures and monitoring infection control is a normal part of life. We haven't actually got to that yet, and we've still got a long way to go, I would suggest, to take that forward. So I wanted to just talk on the police approach, what we've already learned, what we've heard, and try and apply a little bit of theory. Part of this project, this British Council project, is to look at how we can research and put together responses for the future. So we'll keep looking at those elements from an education point of view. I wanted to just start off with, this is the history of the Met, just saying, the Met, which was first modern police force in the UK, one of the first modern police forces in the world, has nearly 200 years to get where it has today. It's not done stuff so quickly. And when you look in the past, offences have been brought in after there's been a lot of discussion. They have been ratified through the courts, through testing and refining with case law, and they last there for a long time. So the Offences Against the Persons Act came in at 1869, sorry, right at the beginning of the Met Police. Nearly 200 years later, it's still there. The Theft Act, nearly 50 years. Police and Criminal Evidence Act, how we process policing, 35 years. These have been brought in and have been brought into the sort of way people like to see things, through court testing, through looking at legitimacy at our society behind, does society agree with what we're doing, and those sorts of gentle changes which make sure they get right. This year we've seen 200 new items of legislation brought in around coronavirus, constantly changing rules and regulations. As Matt Twist was explaining, some of them are laws, some of them are advice. And somehow we're expecting to have got that all right in such a short period of time, and to have done that without the same sort of political oversight, without the same sort of oversight from the courts, making sure that the laws are doing exactly what we want them to. So I think, the unintended consequences are things that we will live with for a while. I'm not saying we shouldn't have brought them in, but I think we need to be very aware of these issues. The whole thought of new technologies, May Britt was talking about some of the new technologies being used around the world, the use of drones for surveillance, the use of monitoring people on phones and other issues, just to see whether or not they're carrying out criminal acts under the coronavirus laws. That's going to have some unintended consequences down the line about how people think about the police and what is expected. It will change what social norms are, and effectively, normally we would deal with these things through education over a reasonably long period of time and through refinements. We haven't had that this year. I want to just sort of jump right back to what the police are about. We've had a few discussions around it. I think these two bits of Peel's principles, the absence of crime and disorder, and the concept of the police of the public and the public of the police, sort of sum up exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to get rid of crime, and we're trying to do it in a way that the police use the least amount of force and more integrated into society as possible. So absence of crime is really a measure of social governance and control, how well society is held together, and police integration within society is the measure of legitimacy. How legitimate does society think we as the police are in what we're trying to do? And I think those are quite important concepts to be thinking about when we go through this subject. This model is from Harcourt. It's a model of social influence as a way of deterrence. And it says that there are three sorts of aspects in a social, where governance is good. You have honest people feel safe and criminals don't commit crimes. The community is in control and criminals are in check. So the balance is around people who comply are the people who are in control. There is an order around society. And those are created by these sorts of aspects of social influence. People are influenced when the community is in control, to be honest, because they can see there's a gain from doing it. Orderliness creates a meaning in society because people can see how things work and what they're supposed to be doing. And social norms are defined by people who are orderly, who are honest. So you sort of develop a whole thought of society which works around these sorts of anchors, if you like, these big blocks of behaviours through these approaches. Another model of deterrence, another model of preventing people committing crime is an economic model. This is sort of, if you like, rational choice theory and routine activity theory. If you're unlikely to be detected, if there's a significant gain, if you had unfulfilled needs, you're more likely to commit crime. If they are likely to get detected and punished, there's little gain and the basic needs are met, then you're less likely to commit crime. So these two models really are key to the aspects of how policing is defined in the UK and in many countries. We do as much as we possibly can to create this social structure. This is what community policing is all about, is trying to influence this. And then we create an environment where people are less likely to commit crime because they think they'll be detected, there's less gain, and the society is looking at their wider needs. What we've seen is these two models, if you apply them to what we've been doing to deal with people who breach coronavirus laws, probably are less effective in terms of thinking than we have had in the past. So let's jump onto here. There we go. Go back to this one. So these two models would work normally. However, if you look at the economic model on the right and think about that in a society where fear of the disease has been pushed very high. In our country, in the UK, we have a very large number of deaths. We have a large prevalence of the disease. But for many people, they aren't ill. They've not met people who are ill. So the fear element has been built up, but the reality is slightly disjointed from it, but the fear is very high. can people gain from breaching coronavirus laws? Well, the gains are social gains, really. They're not that many gains around economy, unless, of course, you're likely to lose your job. So if you don't go to work and you're in the poorly paid group, the likelihood is you're going to be one of the people whose jobs don't succeed. Are basic needs being met? Well, people probably at the moment would suggest they're not. Society's changed quite considerably, so they're not. So the economic model doesn't really apply to where we are at the moment. Detections, the number of people who've had fixed penalty notices applied to them is very small, and as we heard earlier on today, 60% of them have never been acted upon. So there isn't a real fear of being caught. So these sorts of models aren't really applicable. And when we look at the social influence models, they're also really quite unsustainable, because society itself has changed. We no longer have the normal controls over society, the normal sorts of thoughts about what is a criminal, what is not a criminal. When is it a criminal, your next door neighbour, because they have members of their family around? Do honest people feel safe? Probably not, even if they are honest at the moment. There's a degree of feeling unsafe because the messaging from government is you shouldn't feel safe. Is the community in control? Well, I don't think it is. I think everybody feels at the moment that everything is out of control, that the pandemic is driving where we're going, the economy is out of control, health is out of control. And those people who choose not to comply, they're probably not in check. So it's quite a complex breach of these big chunks. And orderliness, we heard about London being empty, and London is still relatively quiet compared with how it was in the past. But we've also seen from the crime data that violence and disorder is growing. We've seen from the demonstrations, we heard about the big demonstrations that have happened recently, but there were already the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the summer, where there was a lot of disorder within them. So we see that the social influence is breaking down and the economic model is breaking down. Those two aspects push the police towards a position of more and more intervention, more arrests at demonstrations, more issuing of fixed penalty notices, and then eventually more other approaches to prevent and control crime. I think when I was putting this presentation together before today, now this 3 or 4 E's really does set up how policing has been in the past. This is the model we've always used, the iron fist in the velvet glove. So starting off with engaging people, then you educate people, then you encourage people, and at the very last point, you enforce people with what's going on. Now, I want to come back to that in a minute, because when you think about the pressures on the police officers, although police have not been overwhelmed with ill health, with abstractions, Met was still running at 19% abstraction rate. So that's 3 times the worst it normally gets in a year. That is a big abstraction rate for an organisation to cope with, especially when you think so many of the staff are working from home as well. So many other things have changed. And all of that applies to the police officers at the front end who are trying to go out and deal with this difficult job. I thought it was worth just having a little bit of reflection about what works to prevent crime. And Maybrit has talked a lot about the crime harm index and applying that with hotspot patrolling, and how that there's a lot of evidence that that works. I think the one sentence that Larry Jarman sort of used, which I think is most effective, is that the more focused a police strategy is, the more likely it is to prevent crime. And what we have seen over the past 6 to 8 months has been a constantly evolving police strategy, being driven by a health crisis, and therefore maybe not as focused as it needed to be, therefore maybe not able to look at the key issues it should be, and therefore putting additional stress on society. These sorts of things that we know that I've just sort of run through are really important, because as over time we live with what's happened, we are going to see some of these unintended consequences start to play out. And I think May-Britt was sort of talking about, we've got quite a long time to go just with waves of the pandemic. We've got even longer time to go for the whole world to address this pandemic and to think about the economic fallout of what's happened. So this is not something that's going away quickly, and yet we're not 100% sure of what it is we are going to be trying to do in policing terms moving forward. These are the sorts of policing messages from within the UK. So at the moment, hands, face and space has just been replaced again. We had stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Then we had eat out to help out, so people were encouraged to go back out. And then the two pictures in the bottom left were students going back to university, and a big drive by government to get students back to university, meaning that several million people travelled across the UK in a 1 or 2 week period. And then there was a degree of revelry and enjoyment leading just, well, I don't know if it's leading, but happening just at the beginning of our big second wave. The map on the right is our tier system at the moment. So the dark red are the people in the highest concentrations. For those of you may notice that I'm not in Kent at the moment, but Kent is in tier 3, so the bottom right hand corner in the worst areas. But everywhere in England, apart from apart from Cornwall, is in is in high or very high area with very severe constraints on what people do. So I thought also, if we were looking at that, we ought to look at what else is going on. So a few people have talked about social disquiet with the Black Lives Matters, the demonstrations and the terrorism. I think thinking about that social control model and thinking how disrupted it is at the moment, and how particularly disrupted it is for BAME communities, how particularly impactful it has been on young people, and how isolating it has been. There is a real risk around social disquiet building, and these areas not being one-off things, but things that are problems for quite a considerable period of time. I think, we saw crime drop, but we've now seen crime growing quite considerably, and we've seen particularly around harmful practices in cyber, but many other crimes as well are now starting to grow quite quickly. And I think May-Britt's comment about, criminals have got to catch up on lost time effectively is a really worthwhile thought process. There are a lot of people out there with a deficit who are criminals, as well as people who are not criminals. And the other thing is about these high-profile investigations. That we had Dominic Cummings back in the summer, who was an advisor to the Prime Minister who travelled across the country when he was ill. We've had a SNP, a Member of Parliament from the Scottish National Party, Ferrier, who knew she was ill but travelled on a train across the country to go back to her home. All these things have put additional demands on the police on top of trying to deal with this new issue. And then there are the other factors, the personal risk. And I think Martin talked, it wasn't just Martin actually, but a couple of people who talked about this.
Please enter your company number, followed by the hash key.
And too soft on coronavirus rules. So there's a real issue about the police being asked not to be too tough on what they're doing, but then when they have sort of eased back, being told they're too soft on things. That's very confusing for the officers, but it's also very confusing for society, who don't know what the right message is. So I think if you put all that together, we've got these issues of safety, got issues of fairness. We've seen social media explode, not just amongst young people, but as more people have had to become tech savvy, there are more people now looking at them, and many older people who maybe aren't used to some of the extreme messages on the social media and getting sucked into the anti-vax discussions and all those sorts of things. And there's a degree of anxiety amongst society brought about by all of that. And I think that's the the key issue for us is that somehow we have to get this anxiety under control. I think, one of the presentations we had today from Matt Twist, in fact, from all of the police officers, has been extremely stable, clear messaging and just carrying on in a straight line. I think that is very important for the future. These are the impacts that we've talked about through the workshops, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's involved in them because they've given us quite a lot of depth into seeing them. But there are many more impacts out there, and there are many more things which will come to light, as we move forward in the future. And the one thing I thought was worth just picking up on is a theory called terror management theory, which sort of talks about how people as individuals deal with fear, and that our drives to do things in society work on a basis of self-preservation, and that culture provides the symbols of a sense of order. In other words, how things work, how our daily routine is, how our interactions with other people, that creates a sense of order, which helps us deal with some of the risks that are around for us, some of the things that challenge us. And when these things are challenged, then people's anxieties lose this mechanism of control. So when you stop going to work, when your communications is controlled by somebody else, when there is a huge fear about something, when society is going through a major change, people are less likely to have those same controls. And if we apply this back to that social model, we see some of the things that we've already started to emerge. Crime and disorder becomes seen as a solution. Terrorism, I would put in there as well. People look to radicalized solutions to try and put some order into what's going on. There's a new meaning and a new focus in society. So that leads to a risk of disorder because people aren't quite sure what it is they're trying to achieve. And as there are new norms, there's less compliance. So people feel unsafe, there's a lack of feeling of safety, and that drives a community, crime being out of control generally. So my concerns sort of moving forward are that we've got this whole set of pressures which are, one, going to impact upon the economic model of crime control, which we've used for many years, two, going to impact upon social models of crime control, and at the same time we're going to go into this next phase of recovery, which is going to be around economic recovery. It's going to be about how do we get society back on track, how do we deal with the borrowing that's gone on to finance everything to date, all of which is going to put some greater pressures on the police. So I think I just wanted to round all of that up, because for us, the London Policing College and within the University of West London, we are working on this British Council project, and we need to sort of think about some of these underlying things so that we can provide the police, one, a network of communications across the world, which things like today have done really well at, but secondly, that we can start doing some thinking around these things and create some situations for people to talk about these things. And we need to define some research questions. So as we move on from here, from today, we'll be looking at pulling together all of the information we've had to date, and we'll be asking you some questions for some more information. And we're really hoping you'll be able to provide that to us so that we can start thinking about what will that be like in the future, what will the policing response be like, and how things could be improved. So I think it's time for me to pull that to a close and just ask if there are any questions people would like to ask before we close for the day. So I'm not sure if it's Karen or Bob who's going to manage the questions.
There was one question, Rod. How do you think changes in public perception will impact future expectations of the role of policing? That's from Polly.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant question. I don't think at a time as society we're ready to even begin to think about that. But I do think this shift into far more focus on policing private spaces and control of people's social society from where we were before will really impact on the public police relationship and put a lot more strain on officers. And it was really, I think, not just refreshing, really positive to hear Martin Hewitt talking about this in such a controlled way and thinking about where they were going in the future with all of that. But that will be a major challenge for police in the future.
Yeah, Rod, I agree. I think the heartening bit about Martin's was, despite everything that's going on and all the pressures on him and senior colleagues, you know, throughout the UK and probably, I'm sure, other parts of the world, that they're already thinking ahead about what the future for policing looks like, relationships with government, have we heard, relationships with the societies they police, which for me was the most heartening part, because our starting point for the conference was not so much what we've already done in the workshops and the interesting debate and the here and now of what we're seeing around the world in front of us, but it's about how we can collectively take policing forward to deal with the new challenges and maybe what the new normal is going to look like. And I'm hope that that's what we've tried to achieve with today's conference.
Yeah, I think, Bob, it's been it's been great the way the team have led through today. But I think the presentations today have really shown that forward focus approach and how important it is. Yeah,
they have, and Rod, hopefully you'll back me up, and Karen and Daisy as well in the background, who we'll thank in a minute. But we're hoping from this that everything that you've seen and heard today, colleagues out there, will be available to you. We will send you out the link so that you can go back over some of those presentations and hopefully use it within your own force, your own organisation, your own university, as food for thought for how you're going to develop your plans for 2021 and beyond. We'll also put this available on the London Policing College YouTube site, so you're ready to go back in there and look at the presentations and a recording of hopefully the whole day. Been one or two glitches, usually me dropping out, and I apologise for that. We want to write up the findings. So again, thanks to those of you that are putting questions or comments. We'll take those, we'll add them to the and hopefully as well in the background we're looking to write an academic paper that again will be available. And I'm hoping in summary, Rod, the whole day has been about drawing together the international community, and again thanks to the London Policing College, because that's a large part of your remit, I know, but bringing this community together to discuss this unprecedented pandemic, but the policing response to it and the way forward. Hopefully that's been a great success. I appear to have frozen.
No, you're all right. No. You're moving.
You haven't. There's just one last contribution from Paul, if we've got time for one more point to be raised.
We're in Rod's hands. We're in his time now.
Yeah. No.
I can't hear what he said.
I think, Karen, that was yes. Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Karen.
Thank you, Rod. It's Paul West.
Lovely. Paul, would you just like to make your point?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. It's Paul West speaking. Thanks very much for that input. And just listening to you talk, and again, I've got quite considerable experience of international policing, and the UK view of the world is that our model of policing is in general much more interventionist than some more repressive traditional countries, if I can put it like that. But this year has thrown us, the British policing, into that sort of, again, if I use that term, repressive style of policing, I think, keeping people locked in their own homes, questioning why they're out there. And it's a fascinating sort of thought that, what's the long-term impact going to be on the Peelian approach to policing, which is very much, that's an anathema to it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there are probably two big things that we haven't touched on, which I would have loved to have spent quite a bit of time on. One was the perceptions of change around the policing model in countries where the role of police is much more aligned to central government and party politics. So if you were to take a country like China, where the police is very controlled centrally because it's run by a central government department, as opposed to in the UK policing, where we have this community link and this sort of ways of changing that slightly, so the message is not quite as straight, if you like, from central government. Actually, what's the difference in perceptions of the police and the police role in theirs? Have we shifted more than them or not? I think it would be a really good question. The other one I thought was quite interesting is some research that's come out just recently looking at the countries that have had the least incidents of COVID and had best results in actually controlling it, and that they are majoritively countries led by women. And looking at not necessarily being about a male-women style, but wondering how much of the leadership style of government actually applies to how the policing role is delivered and how effective that becomes as part of a much more integrated response to this problem. I'm actually at a friend's wedding in Barbados at the moment, which is really lovely to be in Barbados and to have got here. But the key thing I noticed here is that the whole of society, everybody's washing their hands constantly. Everybody's wearing a mask. Everybody is taking temperatures when you get into a taxi, when you get out of a taxi, when you go to a shop, when you come out of a shop. A completely different thought process, but it's not being driven by police or by state intervention. Everybody has just decided to be completely on board with all of these sorts of control mechanisms. And we seem to have been, what I've seen in the UK was we were very nervous about these control mechanisms. So we didn't suggest people wear masks. We didn't do all of those sorts of things early on, but we've gone into quite an interventionist approach around policing, issuing lots of fixed penalty tokens. So it's a really mixed message. And I think those sorts of points you were raising there, Paul, are the sorts of things that we ought to be looking at over the medium term to work out what does that mean about policing for the future.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great response. Thank you, and thanks ever so much for everybody putting today together. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So it's just for me to thank for Bob to finish up from my perspective. Thank you for the team and thank you for everyone who's participated. But Bob, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, no, Rod, thank you ever so much. And again, Paul, thanks for your contributions. They're really useful. Can I just finish, ladies and gents, by thanking everybody that's joined us today from wherever you are in the world. I hope you found it useful. But today wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Karen and Daisy, for the hours and hours and hours of work that they've put in, not only getting all our speakers together, making all the technology work, but actually making today run so well. So huge thanks to Karen and Daisy. Thanks to Rod for giving up his time as well there at his friend's wedding in Barbados. But thanks to everybody out there in the policing community, wherever you are in the world. We've seen today the challenges that we're all facing, that you're facing as police organisations. I take my hat off to all of you, and I wish everybody a happy Christmas and a very, very safe and hopefully COVID-free New Year. That's the end, ladies and gents, of the second London Policing College Education Conference. We hope to see you all next year, but please follow the London Policing College on all our social media sites. Look at us on YouTube and look at the recordings of today, and please use all the information that's been there. So that's the end of the day. Thank you ever so much, everybody.